we keep putting things off, even when we know it hurts us later?
Is procrastination really about discipline or something deeper?
This is Elliot.
I'm Pandora.
You're listening to We Might Be Wrong again.
Today, we are doing a deep dive into a pretty massive stack of clinical data, psychological research, and neurobiology.
Right. And our mission today is to uncover why you actually delay tasks. I mean, despite your absolute best intentions.
Exactly. We want to help you figure out if your own constant delays are just an emotional shield or if they're a legitimate glitch in your brain.
It's a debate that affects almost everyone, so let's get right into the source material. Where do you want to begin?
Let's start by dismantling the biggest myth right out of the gate. Procrastination is absolutely not laziness.
I hear that, but honestly, sitting on the sofa, avoiding a work project feels awfully close to laziness to me.
I totally get why you'd think that. It might look similar on the outside, but the internal experience is completely different. Laziness is just pure apathy.
So you're saying if you're truly lazy, you simply don't care about the uncompleted task at all.
Right, exactly. But procrastination involves intense internal conflict. You care very deeply, and that caring is actually what causes your distress.
I'm not sure I buy the phrase intense distress, quite frankly. Sometimes I just really don't feel like updating a dull spreadsheet.
But that resistance you feel is still fundamentally emotional. Psychological research by Soroya and Peigel shows procrastination is actually a short-term mood regulation strategy.
Wait, a mood regulation strategy. So you're saying we delay our work just to cheer ourselves up in the moment?
Essentially, yes. When you're faced with an aversive task, something boring, difficult, or ambiguous, you experience immediate frustration or anxiety.
Okay, so we run away from the spreadsheet just to escape those specific negative feelings.
Yes. Researchers Tice and Botslavsky phrased it perfectly. They say we give in to feel good.
So we're just prioritizing our immediate emotional comfort over our long-term rational goals.
Precisely. And we do it at the direct expense of our future selves. Which brings up this fascinating concept from the philosopher William James.
William James. I haven't heard his work applied to the psychology of procrastination before.
Yeah, he talked about this idea of personal sameness. It's the theory that we should feel a continuous, unbroken psychological connection to the person we'll be tomorrow.
Meaning, I should care about the version of me waking up on Tuesday just as much as I care about myself right now.
In a perfectly healthy brain, yes. But procrastination actually breaks that psychological bridge entirely.
So we just treat tomorrow's version of ourselves like a complete stranger.
We really do. Brain imaging studies even show that when you think about your future self, the neural network lights up the same way it does when you think about a celebrity.
Hold on, so you're saying it's just like maxing out a credit card. The present self gets the goods, and the future self gets the bill.
That is the perfect analogy. You're shifting the emotional burden of this difficult task to someone you barely feel connected to.
I guess the credit card analogy makes sense of the immediate relief. But I still think attributing this to deep emotional distress is giving the brain far too much credit.
How can you say that? The studies clearly show it's a defense mechanism against a very real fear of failure.
I think you're over-romanticizing it, to be honest. The clinical data suggests procrastination is actually a structural biological failure.
A biological failure. Doesn't that completely ignore the psychological reality of the people suffering from it?
Hear me out. Clinical research from people like Dr. Sunil Reg points out that this is specifically a dopamine timing mismatch.
I'm not sure I followed the jump there. How does the timing of chemical make us avoid our to-do lists?
Think of the brain as having an internal stopwatch for motivation. Normally, something called a phasic dopamine signal acts as the starter motor for any action.
So this phasic signal is supposed to fire right at the beginning of a task to get you moving.
Right. It's the anticipation of a reward that physically pushes you into action. But for procrastinators, that stopwatch is completely broken.
Meaning the dopamine signal doesn't fire when they sit down to work.
Precisely. The reward signal is delayed. It only arrives in the very end of the task rather than initiating the action.
Oh, wow. So their brain literally isn't giving them the chemical fuel required to start the engine?
Yes. Think of it like getting the championship trophy before you've even started running the race. Why would your brain bother running?
That's a fascinating way to look at it. But surely emotions play a part in why that stopwatch breaks in the first place, right?
Not necessarily. It's often just a failure of proactive control and weak working memory. It's a mechanical error, not just sadness or fear.
I have to disagree with you there. If you look at the neurology from the clinical data, the mechanics are clearly hijacked by the emotions.
How could a temporary emotion rewrite a structural dopamine response?
Because of the limbic system, which is our emotional center. In highly stressful situations, it completely overpowers the prefrontal cortex.
The prefrontal cortex being the rational, planning part of the brain that tells us to finish the project.
Right. Think of the amygdala like a hyperactive fire alarm. When it senses the anxiety of a difficult task, it pulls the alarm.
And once that fire alarm goes off, the building's management, the prefrontal cortex, simply evacuates. All rational planning ceases.
Exactly. You can't casually write an email when the fire alarm is blaring. Your brain forces you to seek safety, which usually means finding a distraction.
I still think that relies way too much on the concept of fear. What about tasks we aren't afraid of but just find incredibly tedious?
Well, boredom is still an aversive emotional state. The brain avoids it to protect your current mood, effectively shutting down the motivation circuit.
But the mechanical side explains boredom too. It's through a concept called delay discounting.
Delay discounting.
Yeah.
Is that when a future reward feels less valuable than an immediate one?
Exactly. Distant rewards physically feel neurologically weaker to the brain. The payoff for finishing a report 2 weeks from now just doesn't trigger enough dopamine today.
So the executive function just stalls out because the chemical reward is too far away to matter.
It's a stark contrast to how our brains handle instant gratification. In a video game, every single action provides an immediate dopamine hit, so you keep playing.
That makes total sense for people who passively avoid their work. But what about the people who claim they actively choose to delay things?
You mean the people who say they thrive on the pressure of a last-minute deadline?
Yes. Have you seen the study by researchers Chu and Choi on this?
I've seen it mentioned, yes, but I remain highly skeptical of any study trying to validate bad habits. Intentionally delaying just sounds like an excuse for terrible time management.
Well, the clinical data actually says otherwise. They identified a distinct group called active procrastinators who deliberately suspend their actions.
And we're supposed to believe these people are somehow better off than regular procrastinators.
Surprisingly, yes. These active procrastinators are actually linked to higher emotional intelligence and far more resilience.
Wait, higher emotional intelligence. How does putting things off make you emotionally smarter?
Because they possess a highly dependable temperament. They know exactly how much pressure they need to perform, and they intentionally manufacture it.
Before we get into manufacturing pressure, if you're an active procrastinator, or just pretending to be one, take a second right now to hit like and subscribe before you put it off.
Very smooth transition there. But seriously, Chu and Choi argue that this active delay is a genuinely adaptive coping style.
I immediately have to push back on that, using the critique published by Chowdhury and Peichel.
What was their counter-argument? Because the performance results for these active delayers were actually quite high.
They argue that the terms active and procrastinating are mutually incompatible. It's an oxymoron.
How so? If they're deliberately choosing when to do the work, aren't they actively managing their time?
No, the critiques suggest that what they're doing is simply arousal delay, and it's entirely maladaptive.
So you're saying they aren't clever time managers, they're just adrenaline junkies?
Exactly. It's a dysfunctional coping mechanism for people whose dopamine circuits require absolute panic to function.
That's a pretty harsh way to look at it. You really don't think some people genuinely just work better under a tight deadline?
I think their executive dysfunction is so severe that they have to rely on the massive cortisol spike of a looming deadline to override their broken dopamine timing.
Okay, well, let's see if we can find some common ground in the extremes. Let's look at adults diagnosed with ADHD.
That's actually a perfect test case for this debate.
Hmm.
In ADHD, both emotional regulation and executive function are clinically impaired.
Right. The dopamine timing is structurally off, but the emotional reactions are also heavily magnified. And what we see in those patients is a brutal guilt cycle.
What exactly do you mean by a guilt cycle? How does that start?
It starts the moment they avoid a task. They feel a very brief, temporary relief, but then the aftermath generates massive self-judgment and shame.
And I imagine that intense shame probably depletes whatever executive function they had left to begin with.
It absolutely does. It creates this horrific downward spiral, and it's entirely driven by something psychologists call counterfactual thinking.
Counterfactual thinking. Is that when we imagine alternate realities or different ways a situation could have played out?
Yes, exactly. Normally, healthy individuals use upward counterfactuals. They say things like, if only I had started sooner, I would have gotten an A on that test.
That sounds highly motivating. It essentially gives your brain a roadmap on how to fix the problem for next time.
It is motivating, but chronic procrastinators don't do that at all. They rely almost exclusively on downward counterfactuals instead.
I'm not sure I understand the difference. Give me a real-world example of a downward counterfactual.
Think about the last time you put off a major assignment. Did you tell yourself, well, at least I got it handed in, I could have failed entirely?
Oh, wow. So instead of looking at how they could have done better, they compare their outcome to an absolute disaster just to feel okay.
Precisely. They use this downward comparison to repair their immediate mood. But doing so completely destroys any motivation to change their future behavior.
See, I think this actually proves my point about a broken mechanical feedback loop.
Wait, how does rationalizing failure prove a mechanical glitch in the brain? It sounds purely emotional to me.
because the brain is deploying a cognitive distortion to bypass the fact that its executive misfire just caused a major problem. It's desperately masking the error.
I guess I can see that. But the mask itself is purely emotional. It's still fundamentally about protecting the ego and repairing the mood of the present self.
But it's a self-preservation protocol triggered by a failure in proactive control. I think we're just looking at two sides of the exact same coin here.
Fair enough. So if we agree that procrastination is a complex mix of both a mechanical glitch and an emotional shield, how do we actually fix it?
Well, since I lean heavily toward the mechanical side, I advocate for strict structural fixes. Dr. Reed suggests a method called task chunking.
That's breaking a massive, overwhelming project down into tiny, manageable steps, right?
Exactly. By completing a tiny step, you manually shift that dopamine signal earlier in the process. You give the brain a mini reward right away.
That makes a lot of sense. It completely bypasses the delay discounting problem, where the final reward feels too far away to matter.
Right. But you can't just break the task down. You also have to use cue-based reward pairing to really train the brain.
What does cue-based reward pairing actually look like in practice?
You pair the immediate start of an aversive task with a tangible reward. It manually trains the brain's broken internal stopwatch to act sooner.
So you're saying I should eat a piece of chocolate the exact second I open the dreaded spreadsheet?
Yes, or you listen to a specific, highly anticipated song only when you sit down to work. You also need external accountability to act as scaffolding for your weak executive function.
I really have to counter that approach. Mechanics and strict schedules absolutely do not work if you're already paralyzed by guilt.
You don't think a well-structured, color-coded to-do list can cut through that guilt cycle?
Not a chance. If you deeply hate yourself for procrastinating yesterday, a new planner isn't going to save you today.
So if structural scaffolding isn't the answer, what is the emotional fix?
You have to start with radical self-compassion. The clinical research shows a massive negative correlation between procrastination and self-kindness.
Wait, being nice to yourself actually makes you work harder. That sounds incredibly counterintuitive.
It sounds backward, but it works because it lowers the severe stress and anxiety associated with the task. If you forgive yourself for delaying, the task stops feeling like an active threat.
I suppose that tracks with the neuroscience. If the amygdala isn't detecting a massive threat, it won't pull the fire alarm and shut down the prefrontal cortex.
Exactly. Once the panic subsides, your rational brain can come back online. But to maintain that, you also need mindfulness and metacognition.
Metacognition is essentially thinking about how you think, right? Being aware of your own thought processes.
Yes. It's developing the ability to sit with the negative emotions of a hard task, the boredom, the intense frustration, without immediately needing to escape them.
So instead of fleeing to social media the second you feel bored, you just mentally acknowledge the boredom and force yourself to keep working.
Precisely. You slowly build a psychological tolerance for discomfort. You train yourself to stop prioritizing your short-term mood over your long-term goals.
That requires an incredible amount of mental discipline. It's essentially rewiring your default emotional responses.
It does take discipline, but it's a mental muscle you can build over time. And doing so finally bridges that gap of personal sameness with your future self.
Because by voluntarily doing the hard thing now, you're actively taking care of the stranger you'll be tomorrow.
Exactly. You finally stop handing them the bill for your present comfort.
I think we've actually built a pretty unified theory here.
Yeah.
Procrastination is a dopamine timing glitch that triggers a massive emotional panic response.
And we repair that glitch with structural task chunking, all wrapped in a very heavy dose of self-compassion.
So maybe the very first step to finally getting things done isn't buying a better planner or downloading another productivity app.
Maybe it's simply forgiving yourself for the things you delayed yesterday.
But before we wrap up, if we zoom out, there is another, perhaps more uncomfortable question we should be asking about all of this.
I'm intrigued. What's the question?
If our brains possess this underlying vulnerability, this mechanical dopamine glitch, coupled with a desperate need for emotional avoidance, what is our modern world doing to it?
Oh, that is a dark thought. You mean how every social media app and algorithm is specifically designed to offer instant, frictionless emotional relief?
Exactly. We've built an entire digital ecosystem that perfectly weaponizes our natural urge to delay.
We might not just be fighting our own biology anymore. We might be fighting an environment completely engineered to distract us.
It's definitely something to think about the next time you find yourself endlessly scrolling instead of working.
Maybe procrastination isn't laziness, but a coping mechanism we've misunderstood.
If this made you think a little differently, hit like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for listening.